In the crowded chamber of Congress, tension hung heavy in the air. It was the kind of moment when silence says more than words, when everyone in the room knows something unforgettable is about to happen. At the center stood Nancy Pelosi, a figure who has dominated Washington for decades. And yet, in this instant, she was about to face something she hadn't prepared for. A senator rose to speak, armed not with theatrics, but with sharp facts, and what he said would leave Pelosi frozen in her seat. This wasn't a routine debate. It wasn't a speech rehearsed for sound bites or applause. This was raw, direct, and unshakable. The senator began by pointing out what so many Americans had been whispering, but few in power dared to say aloud, that for too long politics had become less about serving the people and more about protecting power. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't shout, but every word cut through the chamber with precision. Each line peeled away the protective armor of excuses, leaving Pelosi standing not as a seasoned politician, but as someone finally confronted by the truth. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of her reaction. For viewers at home, it was impossible to look away. This was more than political theater. It was accountability playing out in real time. The senator's words carried weight because they weren't coated in slogans or layered with rhetoric. They were grounded in facts, and facts have a way of silencing even the loudest critics. Pelosi, usually quick with a counter or a deflection, remained still. That silence became its own story. It told the audience that even she, with all her years of political experience, could not easily dismiss what had just been laid before her. The moment was gripping, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was calm and undeniable. For the millions watching, this was not just another clip from Congress. It was proof that even the most powerful figure rest could be held accountable when truth is delivered with clarity. The senator's opening remarks framed the night's events as more than politics. They were about integrity, responsibility, and the duty every leader owes to the people who placed them in office. From the very first line, the audience felt the weight of what was unfolding. They weren't just being asked to listen, they were being pulled into the story, reminded of why these debates matter and why leadership must always be measured against truth. And in that opening exchange, one thing was already clear. The balance of power in that room had shifted, and Nancy Pelosi was on the receiving end of a reckoning that would be remembered long after the chamber emptied. To understand why this moment in Congress hit so hard, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. Nancy Pelosi has been one of the most recognizable names in American politics for decades. She served as Speaker of the House, leading through some of the most heated battles in Washington. Her reputation as a strategist, as someone who knew how to count votes and command her caucus, made her a towering presence in the Capitol. For years, allies praised her discipline, while critics accused her of prioritizing political survival over accountability. And it was that reputation built over years of careful maneuvering that made what happened in this chamber so stunning. The senator who challenged her didn't arrive with empty words. He came with history behind him and the weight of frustration shared by millions of Americans who felt left out of the decisions made in Washington. He began by walking everyone back through key moments in Pelosi's tenure, moments when leadership was tested and choices were made. He pointed to the financial crises where ordinary citizens lost their jobs and homes, while Washington's insiders seemed protected. He highlighted the debates over spending bills where transparency was promised but rarely delivered. And he reminded the Chamber of Ethics concerns not because they were new, but because they had become so familiar that many had stopped noticing them. This wasn't about digging up old headlines, it was about connecting the dots between a pattern of leadership and the moment unfolding now. The senator spoke plainly. Politics in America had grown too comfortable with sidestepping accountability, and Pelosi, as one of its most powerful figures, represented that culture more than anyone. By setting this context, he wasn't just criticizing one person, he was holding up a mirror to the system itself. For viewers at home, this background mattered. Without it, the night might have felt like just another political clash. But framed this way, it became clear that what was happening wasn't random. It was the breaking point of years of pent up frustration, years of decisions that seemed to serve power first and people second. And the senator knew his audience wasn't just the members sitting in that chamber, it was the millions watching who had lived with the consequences of those choices, families weighed down by rising costs, communities struggling with failing infrastructure, citizens who felt that Washington had forgotten them. The Senator carefully laid out why this confrontation mattered now. He explained that accountability delayed is accountability denied, and that too many times serious questions had been brushed aside under the guise of politics as usual. He pointed out that leadership comes with responsibility, and responsibility cannot be selective. You cannot choose to represent the people only when it's convenient. You cannot champion transparency while keeping uncomfortable truths hidden, and you cannot claim to serve the public while ignoring the impact of decisions that benefit insiders at the expense of ordinary citizens. In that context, Pelosi's silence during the senator's remarks took on new weight. It was not just a personal reaction, it was symbolic of a larger problem in Washington, the unwillingness of those in power to acknowledge hard truths. The senator's background setting made clear that this wasn't just about humiliation in the chamber, it was about history, catching up with leadership. It was about showing that no matter how long someone has been in power, eventually the record speaks louder than the talking points. And so, as the senator transitioned from background into the heart of his case, the audience was already invested. They understood the stakes, they understood the history, and they understood that this was not just another political squabble, but a turning point, one where truth was finally being spoken plainly in a room that too often rewards silence. The chamber grew quiet as the senator leaned into the microphone. The background had been laid out, the history was fresh in everyone's mind, and now it was time to move beyond context and into confrontation. He didn't waste a single moment. With deliberate calm, he presented the first piece of evidence. It was not wrapped in speculation or opinion. It was a fact backed by documents that could not be ignored. He began by explaining how funds had been shifted through political committees, money that was meant for causes benefiting ordinary Americans, but somehow redirected toward projects that raised questions. He wasn't pointing to rumors, he was pointing to paper trails, numbers that told their own story. And the chamber, used to hearing vague accusations tossed around like political theater, now sat still as the senator walked through the details step by step. For viewers at home, this was the first turning point. Suddenly, what had seemed like another clash of personalities turned into something much larger. It was about accountability backed by evidence. The senator's voice stayed measured, but every sentence landed with force. He wasn't speaking in generalities. He was naming specifics. He connected the dots between decisions made in committees and the benefits that seemed to flow directly to the political elite. The audience didn't need a law degree to follow along. He made it simple, clear, and direct. That simplicity is what made it powerful. Nancy Pelosi, known for her composure, sat motionless. Her silence spoke louder than any rebuttal. In the past, she could have countered with a quick remark, but this wasn't the kind of charge that could be brushed aside with a clever line. This was evidence laid out in black and white. The senator paused just long enough for the weight of the information to sink in, then moved forward with the second revelation. This one tied key policy pushes to decisions that had raised ethical concerns. Again, no shouting, no exaggeration, just a timeline, a chain of cause and effect, and the unmistakable pattern that emerged from the facts. By now, the room was no longer restless. Eyes were fixed on the senator. Viewers at home leaned in closer to their screens. This was the moment the scandal broke open, not in whispers or rumors, but in plain sight. The senator explained why these details mattered, not in abstract terms, but in terms of what it meant for the people. Every time resources are misdirected, he reminded them it means fewer opportunities for families, less support for communities, and more disillusionment among citizens who expect better from their leaders. The power of his delivery wasn't in dramatics, it was in clarity. He painted the picture without needing to embellish it. And the more he spoke, the more it became clear that this was not about partisanship or political rivalry. It was about trust. When trust is broken, when leaders are seen as serving themselves over the people, the entire foundation of governance is shaken. Pelosi's reaction remained steady, but the silence around her grew louder. Reporters in the chamber scribbled notes furiously. Cameras caught the uneasy glances of colleagues, and still the senator pressed on each point, building on the last, each revelation raising the stakes. By the end of his first act, the story was no longer about a single politician under fire. It was about a system of leadership that had strayed from accountability. And that is what made this moment so gripping. For the first time in years, it felt like the walls of Congress were echoing, not with rehearsed speeches, but with unfiltered truth. Viewers at home weren't just hearing about a scandal, they were witnessing the exact moment when it broke open, when facts cut through the noise, and when power itself was forced to stand still under the weight of evidence. The first revelations had already shaken the chamber, but what came next raised the stakes even higher. The senator leaned forward, his voice steady, and announced that the evidence presented so far was only the beginning. He made it clear that what had been revealed wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a much deeper pattern. With that, he directed attention to a set of documents projected on the screens. Each page told a story of money moving through layers of organizations, routed through committees, charities, and shell companies. He explained in plain language how the same handful of entities appeared again and again in connection with political activity ties. The numbers weren't abstract, they were specific, dated, and tied directly to legislative actions. He broke down the process step by step so anyone watching could follow. It didn't take an economist to see what was happening. The money moved in, a decision followed, and the outcome consistently favored the source of the funds. The senator paused only briefly between points, never allowing the tension to fade. He explained how the system was designed to be complex, filled with jargon and financial language that could overwhelm the average person. But when stripped of the unnecessary noise, the pattern was obvious. Foreign money had found its way into the bloodstream of American politics, and leaders entrusted with public office had been at the center of it. The room grew heavier with each new slide of information. The senator wasn't speaking in accusations, he was speaking in verification. Each claim was tied to records from credible institutions, financial disclosures, banking trails, and government filings. He reminded everyone watching that these weren't theories or partisan talking points. These were facts that came from official records. That reminder carried weight, cutting through the suspicion that this could be another round of political theater. Pelosi remained outwardly calm, but the focus of the room had shifted. The senator's words landed with precision, each detail forming another brick in a wall of evidence that was impossible to ignore. Viewers watching live could sense that this was no longer just about embarrassment. It was about accountability in real time to keep the audience engaged. The senator escalated the revelations strategically. He didn't reveal everything at once. Instead, he peeled back each layer methodically, allowing tension to build. First, he tied questionable financial activity to one decision, then another, and then another. By the third example, the pattern was undeniable. People watching didn't have to be told what it meant. They could see it unfold for themselves. The senator then shifted his tone slightly, drawing the focus back to the bigger picture. He explained why these details mattered, not in a technical sense, but in terms of trust. He reminded the chamber that leadership is built on responsibility, and when responsibility is traded for personal gain, the entire foundation weakens. His words were plain, his sentences short, and his delivery sharp. That's what made the message hit so hard. The atmosphere in the chamber was now tense. Reporters stopped whispering to one another and focused entirely on the unfolding testimony. Colleagues exchanged uneasy looks, and even those who usually defended Pelosi sat in silence. For viewers at home, it felt like history was being written live on their screens. As the senator prepared to close this phase of his presentation, he made sure to leave the audience with a thought that would carry into the next act. He revealed that his team had uncovered communications that had been buried, documents that raised even bigger questions about influence and integrity. He didn't reveal them yet. Instead, he promised they would be made public in the next session, leaving a deliberate pause that carried suspense into the following act. This wasn't just a presentation, it was a methodical unveiling, each revelation designed to build on the last, each fact creating momentum that could not be reversed. By the end of this act, the audience no longer wondered if something questionable had occurred. They were left asking just how deep the problem went and how far the evidence would reach. What began as a confrontation with one political figure now widened into something much larger. The senator made it clear that this wasn't only about Nancy Pelosi. What had been uncovered reached far beyond her, connecting to a network of influence that spanned committees, parties, and institutions. He described it as a system, not a single act of misconduct, but a framework that had quietly shaped decision making for years. The audience leaned in as he shifted the focus from one person to the broader structure. He explained how policies that appeared to serve the public often carried hidden benefits for those who funded them. Bills moved through committees at lightning speed when certain interests were at stake, while critical reforms for everyday citizens stalled for years. He connected this imbalance directly to the flow of money and influence, leaving little room for doubt. To make the scope clear, he laid out the timeline of events over a decade of decisions, debates, and votes, all pointed back to the same core issues: access, power, and control. The names might change, the committees might shift, but the mechanics remained the same. Those with the resources shaped the outcomes, while the public was left with explanations that rarely matched reality. The senator's tone was heavier now. His delivery carried the weight of someone not just exposing facts, but explaining consequences. He reminded the chamber that this wasn't an abstract issue. Every diverted dollar, every blocked reform, and every rushed approval had real world effects on citizens who depended on fair governance. Families paid higher prices, communities lost opportunities, and trust in leadership eroded. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the senator pointed out how bipartisan this system had become. It wasn't limited to one side of the aisle. Both parties had at times benefited from the same structures, which explained why so little progress had been made in fixing them. This wasn't a partisan fight, it was a systemic problem. For viewers at home, the explanation was eye-opening. The senator didn't bury his audience in technical details. He used straightforward language to describe how the machine operated. He showed how lobbyists influence legislation, how funding shaped priorities, and how public trust was often treated as expendable. Each point was anchored with facts, but explained in a way that felt human, not mechanical. Pelosi's silence was now part of the story. Her usual sharp rebuttals never came. Instead, the senator's words filled the chamber, unchallenged, building momentum with every sentence. The absence of a defense spoke louder than any argument. To underline the seriousness, the senator brought the discussion back to the citizens. He described how ordinary people were, the ones carrying the cost of these arrangements. Rising bills, delayed reforms, and shrinking opportunities weren't random outcomes. They were the natural result of a system designed to serve the powerful first. His words landed like a reminder of the stakes, not in abstract terms, but in ways every listener could connect with. The structure of the act kept the audience engaged. Each example fed into the next, showing the widening scope of the issue. The senator revealed that internal communications hinted at an awareness of the problem among leadership circles. People knew, but little was done to stop it. That detail painted the picture of not just corruption, but complicity. By this point, the mood had shifted from curiosity to urgency. Reporters covering the session typed quickly, aware that they were documenting a moment that could reshape public conversation. Citizens watching live streams or broadcasts felt the intensity of a story that was no longer about one name, but about the entire system they lived under. The senator chose his closing words of this section carefully. He said that if leadership could be swayed so consistently by outside influence, then the issue wasn't one scandal. It was a threat to the very foundation of representation. He left no doubt that the next phase would reveal how deep this influence ran and how close it came to dismantling the principles of accountability. With that, the senator paused, his silence filled with anticipation. He had widened the lens from one figure to an entire system. The audience now understood that what they were watching wasn't just a clash in Congress. It was an exposure of the machinery that shaped decisions at the highest levels. And as the chamber grew quiet, one thought lingered: if this system could be exposed, it could also be dismantled. The evidence had built layer by layer, and now the senator shifted into the moment everyone had been waiting for. The chamber grew still as he prepared to deliver the sharpest point of the night. His voice was clear, direct, and without hesitation. This was no longer about suggestion, it was about drawing the line. He began by laying out the central truth: the people had entrusted their leaders with power, and that trust had been compromised. Every piece of evidence pointed to decisions shaped by influence instead of principle. He reminded the audience that when leadership fails in this way, it is not just a mistake, it is a betrayal. The senator's tone sharpened and the pacing quickened. His sentences were short and forceful, designed to strike with clarity. He pointed directly to the fact that citizens had paid the price for years of misplaced priorities, families shouldered heavier costs, communities suffered from neglect, and reforms that could have brought relief were delayed or denied. Then came the turning point. He turned toward Pelosi, meeting her silence with unwavering focus, and declared that the time for avoiding accountability had ended. The words carried weight, not because they were shouted, but because they were calm, firm, and undeniable. For those watching live, it felt like the moment where tension broke into certainty. He pressed further, saying that leadership in Congress was not a private privilege, but a public responsibility. When those responsibilities were twisted for personal or political gain, the people themselves became the victims. He framed this not as a partisan accusation, but as a moral stand. The message was simple: the truth could no longer be buried under procedure or dismissed as noise. The chamber reacted visibly. Some members shifted uneasily. Others looked down, unwilling to meet the senator's eyes. The audience at home felt the impact, as though the words were directed at them personally. It was the kind of moment that defined the narrative: a clash, not of personalities, but of principles. The senator built momentum with precision. He reminded everyone that silence in the face of corruption was itself a choice. He spoke of integrity as the foundation of governance and made it clear that integrity was now on trial. The climax wasn't about one revelation, but about the undeniable truth that could no longer be ignored. Every line carried urgency. He framed it as a point of no return. The system had been exposed, and now the question was simple: would leaders choose to defend the public or protect their power? The way he phrased it made inaction impossible to justify. For the first time in the session, the silence of the chamber spoke louder than words. As he reached his peak, the senator delivered his defining statement. With calm authority, he said that no leader, regardless of position or history, was above accountability, not in Congress, not in government, and not in the eyes of the people. That single line landed like a gavel, sealing the argument with finality. Viewers at home felt the weight of the moment. Reporters rushed to capture the words that would headline the next day, and inside the chamber, the balance shifted. What had started as a tense confrontation had transformed into a defining stand. The climax was not built on theatrics, but on clarity, evidence, and moral conviction. The senator paused just long enough for the words to sink in. Then he looked directly at his colleagues and the cameras, and his tone softened slightly, signaling transition. He said the time had come not just to expose the truth, but to decide what would be done about it. That set the stage for the resolution to follow. The turning point had been reached, the evidence had spoken, the confrontation had been made, and the chamber, along with the audience across the nation, now waited to see what reform, if any, would come next. The climax had passed, but the senator wasn't finished. He shifted the focus from exposure to action. The audience leaned forward, waiting to hear not just what went wrong, but what could be done to fix it. The senator made it clear evidence without reform meant nothing. Change had to follow. His tone was steady, constructive, and deliberate. He explained that the first step toward resolution was acknowledging the scale of the problem. Corruption wasn't confined to one decision or one lead, where it had been allowed to grow into a system, and if a system could be built, it could also be dismantled. He outlined the need for reforms with precision: stronger oversight, transparent financial disclosures, and strict limits on outside influence were not optional, they were necessary. He reminded everyone that leadership was about protecting the people, not shielding power. The senator's language was simple and direct, so no one could miss the urgency of his message. In the chamber, his words carried a weight that was different from the confrontation earlier. This was not accusation, this was a call to responsibility. Even those who had sat silently during the exposure of evidence now listened carefully. Knowing that the conversation had shifted to solutions, he spoke of restoring trust, emphasizing that government only works when citizens believe in its fairness. Without trust, policies fail, cooperation breaks down, and divisions grow deeper. Reform wasn't just about paperwork or procedure, it was about rebuilding faith between leaders and the people they serve. The senator tied every proposal back to ordinary citizens. He reminded the chamber that reforms weren't abstract ideals, they were protections for families who worked hard and expected fairness. They were safeguards for communities that needed resources directed where they mattered most. He used simple examples of how transparency could prevent abuse and how accountability could stop the cycle of influence before it began. Pelosi remained quiet, and her silence now symbolized something larger: the end of an era of unchecked decisions. The senator didn't need her response. The evidence and the demand for reform had already redefined the narrative. The delivery remained hopeful even as the subject was serious. He explained that reform was not just possible but within reach. Laws could be changed, processes could be improved, and oversight could be enforced, but only if leaders chose to act. He framed it as a test: would Congress rise to meet this challenge, or would it allow the system to continue unchanged? For viewers at home, the message was empowering. The senator wasn't leaving them as passive observers. He reminded them that reform was not only the responsibility of lawmakers, but also the demand of the people. Pressure from citizens, he said, was often the spark that ignited real change. As he moved toward the end of this act, the senator tied the narrative together. From scandal to exposure to climax, it had all led to this, a choice. The system had been unmasked, the flaws had been made clear. Now it was time to decide whether accountability would remain a promise or become a reality. He concluded with a forward looking tone: reform was possible, trust could be rebuilt, and leadership could be restored to its rightful purpose. But the path forward depended on action, not words. The chamber was left in silence, not of shock this time, but of reflection. And the audience across the country knew that the story was not ending here, it was beginning anew with the chance for real change. The chamber was quieter now, but the echoes of the senator's words still hung in the air. What began as a confrontation had transformed into something larger, a lesson in integrity, a reminder of accountability, and a call for every citizen to take ownership of the democracy they shared. The senator looked directly at his colleagues and then through the cameras spoke to the people watching at home. His voice was steady, not dramatic, but it carried the kind of clarity that comes only when truth is laid bare. He distilled the entire moment into three lessons. First, integrity is not optional. Leaders cannot demand trust if they are unwilling to be transparent. Every position of power comes with a responsibility to act with honesty, not convenience. Second, accountability must be constant. It isn't enough to expose core option after the fact. Systems of oversight must be strong enough to prevent it before it happens. Accountability is what keeps democracy alive. And third, the loyalty of every public servant must rest with the people they serve, not with outside influences, not with personal gain, but with the citizens who place their faith in them. Without loyalty to the nation, leadership becomes hollow. These lessons were not spoken as abstract ideas. They were grounded in the events the chamber had just witnessed, evidence laid out in detail, and reactions captured in real time. The senator connected each lesson back to the scandal, showing how a failure of integrity, accountability, and loyalty had created the crisis in the first place. Then he turned his focus outward. To the viewers at home, he said plainly, democracy is not a spectator sport. It was a reminder that change does not come from speeches alone. Citizens have the power to demand reforms, to hold leaders accountable, and to ensure that integrity remains the foundation of governance. His words carried the rhythm of conviction, simple and direct without exaggeration. He encouraged citizens to speak up, to question, and to remain engaged. Reform, he explained, begins with awareness but succeeds only through participation. Pelosi's silence in that moment became part of the story, not because she had no words, but because the senator's clarity had left no ground to stand on. The silence symbolized the weight of truth, undeniable and irreversible. The call to action was framed not as anger but as empowerment. The senator reminded viewers that every voice mattered. Letters to representatives, local town halls, community forums, and even conversations among neighbors all built the momentum that could drive lasting change. He ended with a quote of his own, one that captured the essence of the entire confrontation. Power belongs to the people who demand integrity, and it remains only as strong as their will to protect it. The camera stayed on him for a moment longer, capturing the final image of a leader standing firm not in triumph over an opponent, but in service to the truth. And with that, the story came to a close, not with scandal alone, but with the possibility of renewal. The audience at home was left with more than just the memory of a dramatic exchange. They were left with a challenge to carry those lessons forward, to remain vigilant, and to demand better from those chosen to lead.